All right, so how many of you have ever coached like a little league or some sort of like younger person team of any sort? Has anybody ever done this? All right. So how many of you, let me ask you this, how many of you know of Upward Basketball? Anybody ever heard of Upward? Okay, you get it. So if you're not familiar with Upward, let me give you a quick kind of synopsis of it, and I'm not judging. I promise I'm not judging. I'm just saying, Upward doesn't really keep score with like 5, 6, 7-year-old basketball. If I remember correctly, everybody kind of gets equal playing time, which is also fun, and then the other side of that, which is even more fun to me, is I don't think you're allowed to steal at that age either because of the 10 Commandments, but we won't talk about that part of it. It's basketball, people. So I want you to imagine this. If you're going to put yourself in one of those games, no, not that kind of game. Let me show you this. This is Upward right here. Yeah, there we go, right? Upward basketball is kind of like this. Now, Upward's interesting. Let me tell you, it's so fascinating. I had a friend in middle school who I was really close to. His sister was playing at like 6, 7-year-old basketball, and his dad was like the most calm, gentle, you know what I mean? Just like that sort of thing. And he was coaching his daughter's team. And what was so interesting is this is in a church gymnasium. So picture this, church gymnasium. You can kind of just imagine this. These are volunteer refs. I don't know what the refs did, but they were there, and all this kind of stuff was happening. And the game was not going well. The coach have you ever watched somebody like progressively get angry over time? You ever seen this before? Like gentle people, kind people just like, oh, they're about to go off. You know what I mean? So like over the course of this game, he's like more and more frustrated, more and more angry. And I'll never forget this. They finally got like a call that went their way in the game. Like one of those like calls that goes their way. And this is a gym full of parents in a church. And this guy with everything in him, with all the anger that he can muster, just yells out, "There is a God!" And then it just goes silence in the gym, right? Dead silent in the gym. Everybody just looks at him. His both hands are up, and he just slowly like puts them down and sits back down on the bench. And I was like this. I remember thinking, like, I've seen this guy, and he's super calm and super chill, and he doesn't have these moments often, and I've never seen a moment. Maybe heard about it before. Have you ever had a moment like that, though, where it was like this? Like something came out of you that didn't feel like it was from you? You ever had one of these? Some of you have had this with a spouse. Like something came out of you and it didn't feel like it was from you at all. Now, I had this in high school a lot. Like one of the things I probably struggled with in high school, I was like coming into understanding my story and like my parents and all this kind of stuff. And I actually got pretty angry. And I was given a book. It wasn't titled this at the time. And so I want to tell you this book. I think you should read it. I think you should get this book. The book is now called Enemies of the Heart by Andy Stanley. It's an incredible book. And so I'm going to show you this for a couple reasons. Number one, I loved this. I think at the time it was called It Came From Within. Like when I read it, I heard him speak on it. The other part is as I was working on this talk, I realized that so much of what I think about this in particular topic was from this book. And so I would write these words out. I'm like, oh, that sounds really good. And I'm like, no, that's Andy. That was an Andy quote right there. So I wanted to tell you, like, you should read this book. It's phenomenal. Parts of this, I'll try to quote him if there's moments that I'm using him, but also this is very influenced by this book, and you should read it. And what he talks about specifically around anger is that it comes from a place. Like, you don't just get angry about a moment. The anger that you have comes from a place. And usually you can kind of hear people say this or talk about it. Like, you might hear a phrase like this, like, I can't believe I just said this, like my friend Barry, right? I can't believe I just said this. I don't know what that's like. Or you might hear something like this, like, that's nothing like me, to which everybody around you who knows you well goes, I mean, a little bit. You know what I mean? I mean, a little bit. Like, that's nothing like me. Or again, we've said this a couple times already. Where did that come from? Like, where did that actually come from? And our understanding of our heart in particular, when we read this, especially in the New Testament or the Old Testament, our understanding of heart is very connected to our emotions, right? I feel something, I love something. Like, our heart is very connected to our emotions. But specifically in the language of the Old Testament was written in, there's a word in the Hebrew word for heart. This is transliterated very much, but it's lev, right? Now, what's interesting about this word in particular is it's not the way that we typically view it, right? Heart here is talking about both your heart and mind brought together in one conscious being, right? So you almost think about like the intellectual side of you and the emotional side of you and then like the soul side of you coming together when it's talking about your heart. Meaning that the things that come out of you a lot are not just coming out of your emotions. They're coming out of your intellectual side and your soul side. They're coming out of the fullness of who you are. And specifically anger, right? Now, anger is one of those things that I think is always both interesting and fun. How many of you are like this, that when somebody gets really, really angry, you find it more and more funny? Is there anybody else like this? Like, you ever seen somebody get angry at a cashier, and there's a little bit of you that's like, calm down. You know what I mean? Like a little bit of that. Like there's something about anger where you watch people with this and you can kind of see like sometimes the anger is so much that it doesn't actually match the moment that it's happening. Sometimes you get angry at somebody that you're not even angry with. You're just angry in general and they just happen to be in front of you at the time. You ever had one of those? Sometimes, again, the bare minimum make me feel better about myself. Anybody ever got angry at their kids, but you weren't angry at your kids at all? Anybody? Yeah? I was playing wiffle ball with my 6-year-old son, and I got angry at him. Well, number one, because he beat me. We won't talk about that. But number two, I got angry at something that happened. I'm like, I'm arguing a call with a 6-year-old about wiffle ball. You know what I mean? I'm not upset at you, buddy. You know what I mean? Like there's a little bit of that where you just feel like anger comes from somewhere, and the place that it comes from is like this. We can say it this way. The anger comes from the idea of like somebody owes me something. Like you owe me something, right? And anger is never a primary emotion like this. It's really a secondary emotion that you're feeling. There's something else often at the root of what's going on, right? And you know that somebody owes you your reputation back because they gossiped about you and they said something about you to other people and they can't really make it right, but what they owe you is your reputation back. Or some of you, it's like your boss owes you a raise or a promotion because you looked at the other person who got it and you're like, for real? You know, like there's a little bit of that. Like they owe you something there. Somebody owes you an opportunity that you didn't get. Somebody owes you a second chance. Somebody owes you a childhood back, right? Somebody owes you like your 12-year-old Little League games back. And they can't repay you of that, but they owe you that time back in your life. And then some of you go like, somebody owes me affection. Somebody owes me a healthy marriage back. Somebody owes me the moments when like my dad looked at me and did this sort of thing over and over and over again. You owe me security back. And whenever anger pops up like this, and there's this moment of being owed something, what's created is like a debt and debtor kind of relationship. And anytime there's a debt, and you know this, the thing that you do to remedy the debt is you got to have payback. Now, I'm not talking about like Mel Gibson, Tarantino movie kind of payback. That's not, I mean, maybe a little bit. That's not really what we're talking about, right? Payback in that they created a debt with you in the relationship. They created a debt with you in the friendship. They created a debt behind your back. They pull something from you and they owe you something back. And the problem with this, and you know this, is that there's nothing they can really do to give it back to you. Like more times than not, again, you know, most of the stuff that you really care about can't be repaid. Like your reputation doesn't get repaired. Like, can you imagine though if somebody got on Facebook and they're like, you know what, I just want to apologize to so-and-so. I gossiped about them. I'm so sorry. And send it out. You've never seen that post ever. It doesn't happen. And even if they did, it only reached like 20 people, you know? Like it doesn't go that way. And what happens is we have this like debt that we carry with people, and especially if you see them over and over again, then you have to almost pretend like it doesn't exist. You ever done this? Like you see somebody like this, and you see them and they just smile at you. And guys will smile back or mildly grunt in the general direction of the other human. Like women are interesting that they can tell you that they're still frustrated at you while smiling because they'll just look you up and down like this. And you know what I mean? I don't know how and you see somebody like this. And if you're like me, what I do is I see somebody like this and I smile and I'm nice and then I have a list. And the list just pops up beside them. Like, I remember that you gossiped about me, that you stole my promotion, that you ate my cheesecake from the work fridge and that you talked about my mama. You know what I mean? Like there's a little bit of that where you feel 3 of those are true. You know who you are. Anyway, there's a little bit of that. You know what I mean? Like there was this moment. I love telling this. I bought Emily one time when we were engaged. She was in Atlanta. I was in Knoxville, and we had gone to New York, and we had this cheesecake that we really loved. And so I spent a lot of money, for me at the time, a lot of money to get her cheesecake from New York City. I had it shipped to her office. Oh, okay, thanks. Anyway. Okay. Anyway, so we did that. Shipped to her office. It got there, and everybody at her work ate it but her. So I drove my butt to Atlanta, and I'm just kidding, I didn't do that. But I was angry. I was angry. And there's a piece of that where you go, like, every time I saw them, this is so petty. Every time I saw them, the list would come up. I know you ate some cheesecake. I thought about it every single time. And there's a piece of that, and you know this. When it comes to these things, some of these really matter, and then some of these don't. But some of them really matter. Like the reputation thing matters to you. The gossip thing matters to you. The marriage thing matters to you. The trust thing matters to you. And you can't really fix that. I put in my notes to say it this way, that the vast majority, specifically relational debt that we experience, can't be repaid. And that's painful because what you want is to be paid back. You want it to be right. But you can't. Some of you are a dad and your son's like older now, and you know, like you can't go back to those games and make that better. You can't. There's nothing you can do. You can apologize, but that doesn't make it paid back. It doesn't create it where the debt's gone. It's just kind of there. You can't pay back some of those things. And what's even harder, and you know this, and this is what's so painful, is that you know people who spend their entire lives holding on to things that will never be repaid back to them. They it's like they lock themselves in a prison and they can't do anything. Like they just hold it, right? They see that list over and over and over and over again. And what's even more painful, and you also know this too, is that the other person doesn't go to bed at night. It's like, I just remember that time I stole the cheesecake. I feel so bad about it. You know how much they're thinking about it? They're just not. That's why they're smiling so big when they see you. They just don't. And you know people have been holding on to this stuff for so long. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about the thing that helps kind of loosen that. And I'll tell you two caveats. Number one, first caveat is if you're not a follower of Jesus, what we're going to talk about for the next few minutes, you're a little bit off the hook on. Now, I think you should do what we're going to talk about. But this is one of those things where the scriptures put the standard so high that if you were going to go, do I really want to do this? This is the thing that makes Christianity hard. Like this is one of those things that go, this is not easy. This is painful. It's difficult and it's counterintuitive. And so what we're going to look at is like that. So if you're not a follower of Jesus, I think you should still do what we're going to talk about. But man, this is one of those things that's like, if I didn't have to, I don't know if I would. You know what I mean? And the second one is this. We're going to look at two passages. The first one's written by a guy named Paul. The second one, we're going to look at a story with Jesus. But when Paul talks about what we're about to look at, it can be very easy to dismiss what he's about to say because of how general it feels in the beginning, and it gets really specific. So I'm going to tell you, if there's any part of you that starts to check out when we start to read what Paul says about this in particular, the first thing I want you to know is, as Paul's writing this, he's in prison for something that he was wrongly imprisoned for. He will be tortured for things that he was wrongly tortured for, and everything I think is wrongly tortured, but you get it. And then the other part about this is he's writing from a place where he gets it, right? He just gets it, right? And so what he's about to say and what he's about to talk about is one of those things that's kind of the antidote for some of this anger, but at the other side of it, it's not written from a place of simplicity, but deep complexity in how to process a particular emotion. So with that, here's what Paul says. He's writing to the church in Ephesus. Here's what he says. He says, get rid of all bitterness and rage and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Now, I want to highlight this because it's so easy for us to kind of bypass this. This is one of those things where Paul is not looking at you saying you should get better at it. Like, he's not saying that. He's like, you should be less angry. That's not what he's saying. He said you should be vigilant. Vigilant? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there we go. You should be hyper vigilant about getting rid of it. And not just a little bit of it. All of it. And so he kind of builds, and I love the way that it's built, especially in the original language it was written in. You get like the bitterness, rage, and anger, which are like, of course, we probably don't want those. Brawling and slander, you probably shouldn't be getting in fights with people, and please don't gossip out there behind their back. But then he's like, and then if I wasn't clear, let me just be very clear about it. And every form of malice. Any excuse you have to carry any of that, stop. And it's said with like this deep sort of urgency. Now, when I was reading this in the book, again, I love this book, Andy has a perfect example. I think it's a perfect illustration, and I'll show you this picture. Andy describes the urgency of this as like walking into a spider web at night. Has anybody ever done that before? Like we do this all the time. Probably once a week I do this. Now, here's the thing about walking into a spider web at night that I think is so much fun, is when you do it, nobody ever walks into a spider web at night and then calmly takes it off their face. Can you imagine that? Like, I got a spider web on me. Oh no, like that, no, they rip their face off, you know what I mean? Like women who have it like all hair, like you just did the date night thing and all of a sudden it's just like, you know what I mean? Like that's what happens. You urgently, violently get whatever's on your face off of your face. You are in the process of getting it done. That's what Paul's talking about. Whatever that thing is that causes that level of urgency for you to solve the problem is what it takes for you to solve the problem. And people who are followers of Jesus don't get to choose whether they're going to have that urgency or not. He's going to look, at the end of the day, you get rid of all of that. And then he says this, he says, and be compassionate to one another, right? Which we would all agree with. Be kind and compassionate. And then he gives sort of this like antidote for all of it. And when he does, it feels overly simplistic and kind of weird and painful when he says it. And he says this, can we just say it together? Forgiving each other. On the count of three, let's say it together. 1, 2, 3. Now it's so easy to say. Like forgiveness is so easy to talk about. Because you kind of do it and you kind of don't, right? Like you kind of forgive people and you kind of don't. Like you kind of stop thinking about the emotions of being angry at them sometimes, but it still comes back up like 3 months later. Like you kind of forgive and then you kind of don't. And what Paul's talking about, like if you want to get rid of all this stuff, is it simplistic and as complex as it sounds, you choose to forgive. And you don't magically choose to forgive, you, in a disciplined sort of way, choose to forgive. And what are you forgiving? You forgive the debt that they couldn't pay you back anyway. And that's hard. That's painful because if you're anything like me, I want justice to be served. And not just general justice, right? I want to be the one who decides what should happen to the person. I want to decide what the payback is. I want to decide what justice looks like for the other person. And Paul goes, no. You forgive each other. To which everybody who's skeptical a little bit like you are goes, but what about, and then they have their story, and you have your story, and I have my story, and your story is good. In fact, you could come up here, you take this thing with Britney Spears mic, and you stand on stage, and you can tell us your story, and we'd all go, yeah, it sucks. And we'd all probably be in your corner. We'd go, I don't know, I forgive most everybody, but and we'd probably all agree. But there's something in you that still feels imprisoned, even in those moments. And so what Paul does is to remove any sort of like conversation about what this looks like for believers. He's like, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other. And then he does this. Just as in Christ, God forgave you. Which all of them go, oh man, you know what I mean? So you pulled that card? And the hard part about this, and this is what's really, really hard, is my question is always around this. Then where is justice if forgiveness is offered at every turn? As if I'm the one who should be the dispenser of all of the justice to everyone else. Where's the justice if forgiveness and grace is shown to other people? Now, there's a systemic piece of this. There's a organizational piece of this. There are things in place that are certainly true that we're not talking about. So I'm not saying that like no one should ever go to prison. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying in the vast majority of things that you hold on to, you being the one who holds the key to whatever payback should be given for the other person, it's just likely not coming. And you know that. Like in your mind, you know that. You know that when you lay in bed at night, you're staring at the fan and you're waiting for them to care about what you care about. It's just not going to be made right. As much as you wish some of those things were, even if they tried, oftentimes they couldn't. And so Paul writes about this and he experiences these things. We also have Jesus talking about this. And the way that Jesus talks about it is unfortunately and beautifully unsettling. You have this moment where Jesus teaches some of his closest followers about all sorts of things in terms of living and what it looks like and how to navigate all these things. And then Peter, who's always the one who kind of steps out and says a little bit too much, a little bit too aggressively, and a little bit too soon, asks Jesus a question, and you get this conversation between Peter and Jesus with others around. And Peter comes to Jesus and he says this. He says, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? And I love this. Up to like 7? Which I love that Peter thought about how many times he should before he came to Jesus. Like, that's the strategic thinker in your friend group, right? Like, look, I thought about it. 7 feels good, you know? Like, 7 feels good. Which means that there's probably somebody he was like at 6 with. You know what I mean? Like, you know? I love that he comes to Jesus like that. Like, is 7 enough? 7 feels good. Because then, and I love this. This is the beauty of like the undertext. Because 7 feels like, I did my part, so now what happens? Now they should do theirs, and I'm going to wait until they do theirs. And the emphasis under 7 is that it's still about the other person. That you're still getting back, and at some point, payback will be given. After 7, it's up to them to figure out how to make things right. And what Jesus responds with, and I love it, he says this. He says, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Now, it's not about the number 77. In fact, in the original text, it's almost like an infinite loop of times. Jesus looks at him like, no, it's not 7 times. It's his infinite loop of forgiveness that you give to other people. And I just imagine this, and I'm kind of reading into it, that Peter's face would have probably dropped because he's probably like at 6 with this person that he's thinking about. You know what I mean? I would love to know what happened. Like, he stole my fish. I don't know. What it was. Like, he's upset. Like, he's in, and Jesus responds to an infinite loop, and I don't know what happens, but whatever it is causes Jesus to go into a parable about what this means. And I'll tell you this. There's the full caveat up front. This is really hard. You could talk about forgiveness and never talk about this passage, and everybody would feel good at the end. Or you could talk about what Jesus actually says, and everybody feel a little bit butt clenched the whole time. So we're going to go with the second one, and we'll be a little bit clenched together. Because what Jesus says is so unbelievably unsettling to people who call themselves Christians that it's just like, oh gosh, I don't know about that part. So he goes into the story, he says this. So therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. And as he began the settlement, a man owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Now, I don't know how much 10,000 bags of gold is, but gold is more expensive than silver. That's really all you need to know in this parable. That since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had been sold to repay the debt. So he's essentially going to send them off to prison for what had happened, which seems like, whoa, and it is, whoa, but that's the cultural context that they're in. And he goes on, he says this. And at this, the servant fell on his knees before him. And he's begging, like, be patient with me, and I will pay back everything. And the servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, forgave the debt, and let him go. Which I love. He's like, oh, and you could end the story here. You know, this is, I love it. At any point, Jesus could have ended these parables. And Jesus could have ended it. So therefore, be like the master and forgive other people, you know? And you would have got it. And it would have felt good. And it'd be like Hallmarky. And then you kind of go forgive from there, you know? It could have been like that. But then he adds this to it. He says, but when the servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. Again, silver less than gold. And he grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. Pay back what you owe me. Can you imagine? He leaves after being forgiven the debt, goes find somebody else, grabs him, puts a chokehold. I don't know what that looks like. Says, I'm demand you give me the debt back. And this person that he's doing this chokehold with then begs him, and he says this. Fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, just like this guy had just done. Be patient with me and I will pay it back. Almost says the exact same thing, which I love. And what does the guy do? It says he refused. And instead he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. And when the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened, which I love. Again, kind of the subtext here is that the guy was just dumb enough to do it in front of the other master's people, you know? And everybody's just hearing the story. Feels like you feel. Well, you shouldn't do that. That's an injustice. You were forgiven. You should forgive. And Jesus could have ended it here. This is, again, one of my favorite. Jesus could have got his point across, put a period here. That was, everybody, oh, that's a great story. You know what I mean? Like you don't be like that guy. That has to whatever. Like that's it. That's it. And then Jesus ups it again. And he says this. So then the master called this other guy back. He says, you wicked servant. I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? And in anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. And again, Jesus could end it here and everybody goes, whew, I don't want that to happen. That's true. We should forgive more people, you know? And that would have been it. Yeah, forgive. That's good. So I don't want that. Yeah, that's great. And most of us go, I don't know about the torture part. I don't know that he should have been held that much accountable, but he should have done the right thing. But what Jesus says next is the part that like nobody likes to read out loud. Nobody likes to see this next part because of how painful it is. And because most of us view Jesus with really long hair and a dress and a little blue sash and he's white for some reason. I don't get it, you know? Like, and he just hugs a lot of lambs. I don't know. That's our view of Jesus. But in front of the people who were his closest followers and the people who would launch the early church into the fullness of history, he looks them in the eye He said, and this is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart or from your lev or from the thing that's the fullness of your being, your intellect, your mind, your soul, unless you forgive them. He says, sweet dreams, and walks away. You know what I mean? That's it. Yeah. And it's the part where you go, like, you have to take it that far? Like, but he does. And he leaves it. There's no, like, next verse where it feels better. That's it. If you don't forgive and you're a part of this new kingdom, you will experience something that is wildly unpleasant. Now, I don't know what this is. I mean, you hear scholars talk about, like, well, what is the thing that's so bad all over? And nobody really knows. All I really know is this, that when you read these texts that Jesus teaches on this particular thing, he has no tolerance for people who have been forgiven and don't forgive. Which means if you're not a follower of Jesus, again, this is one of those things you go, wow, I don't know about the whole thing. And you're like, yeah, I don't know, Jesus is talking to you. I think Jesus is talking to the people who have said, I've been a follower of Jesus. I've experienced the grace and love and the power and the redemptive nature of what Jesus did on our behalf, and I'm forgiven. And Jesus is going, great, now forgive others. And forgive others. And if you don't, this is how my heavenly Father in heaven, like, and the shift here, and the paradigm that's so different, is that we think about our anger and forgiveness through what was done to us. But Jesus pushes us to see all of that through what's been done for us, not just been what's done to us. This is a big question. Like, will I choose to see my situation through what has been done to me or what has been done for me? And it's here, come on, and you know this, it's here where forgiveness is actually found. And forgiveness in some ways is complex because of the emotions that it carries, but super simple. Forgiveness is ultimately canceling the debt. It's canceling a debt that somebody else owes you. And it's not easy, and it's certainly messy, and it's very, very painful. But it's canceling the debt that someone else owes you. Now, I show this picture like 3 times a year, and the reason I only show this picture that much, and the reason we don't have crosses all over our church and that sort of thing, is because I think it should feel startling when you talk about what Jesus did. Because Jesus would teach these things, and then ultimately what he'd do is he would end up on a cross, crucified for you and for me, and taking on the sin, the full sin of the world, so that he could usher in the redemptive nature of God and the power of what God wanted to do. Because God loved you that much. And Jesus did this. And I love this picture, and this picture in particular is hard to find because most scholars would agree that Jesus wasn't like hung on a cross that was like 9 feet in the air in this majestic way with a sunset behind him. Right? He wasn't. It was much more brutal than that, and it was much more painful than that. And what he walked through and what he experienced was hard. And it wasn't pretty. And it wasn't just like a thing to remind you. It was Jesus taking on your suffering and your pain and my suffering, my pain and my sin, taking all of that on himself so that we could experience redemption. This happened in front of his mom at eye level. And you go, why would Jesus do this for us? Why would he take on all of that and forgive us? And it's because God loves you that much, and also because God is inviting you to partner with him in the redemptive nature of the world. The thing about this picture that's probably most difficult is that you're not let off the hook on forgiving people, not just for you. And that's usually where it stops. I'm forgiven so that I can be free. That is true. And also, you are forgiven because those that are followers of Jesus in the world usher in the redemptive nature of Jesus in the world. You forgive for freedom with you, for sure, but it's not just about you and the person. It's about you and all of it. It's about you and the way that Jesus has decided to redeem all things back to himself. And as a follower of Jesus, forgiveness is a part of your world. So, what I like to do is, I'd like for you to think about who that is for you. And some of you had a name as soon as we started talking about it. As soon as I said anger, like some of you, like immediately, you knew exactly who we were talking about. It wasn't like 4 people, it was a guy, it was her, it was that moment, like you knew. Some of you, it is like a group of people, or it is a boss, or it is those things, and you know exactly what we're talking about. So the first question is this, like I want you to identify, like who is it you're actually angry with? Who are you angry with? And it might be a person, or it might be a group of people, you need like a name. Because it's not just an idea in your head. Who is it that you're actually angry with? And the second question is a little bit harder to like unpack, but the second one is like, what do they owe me? And for some of you, that's a long list. Like, it's not like a one thing. It's not like there was that one time. For some of you, it's a long list of what they owe you. And one of the most freeing things that you could ever do is identify what it is that you're actually forgiving. Like, I don't just forgive a person. I forgive the person who did X, Y, and Z. Sorry. A, B, C, D, E, F. Like, you forgive a person that did it all. Like, you know what it is. And it's a group of things that they owe you. And the last one I'm going to say here, and I'm going to talk about this, and we'll wrap up in a second, is this. And then ultimately, forgiveness is when you can settle that debt in your heart. Like, fully in your heart. Which means it requires you to let go of what they can't pay back anyway. And that's hard. And it feels like it's letting them off the hook. And in some ways it might be. But at the end of the day, you're probably waiting for something that's never going to come anyway. The visual that I was given when I was younger was this. Like you lock yourself in a prison and the door is flipped around and you're holding the key. It is ultimately you that gets to decide whether you're going to cancel the debt that somebody owes you. Now, the settle the debt thing is interesting. Most of you know a little bit about my story. I grew up in a single parent home, just me and my mom. I met my dad later on, but one of the things that I processed through in middle school and high school was just the anger that I had with my dad. And the other thing about anger that's so interesting is that anger is never just focused. You know this too. Anger is like, it just spills on people. You know what I mean? Like anger is not focused on one person. Usually anger just kind of spills all over everybody to some degree. You know what I mean? And the people that are closest to you are the ones who feel it the most. And so I remember that. I remember walking so deeply through that. And I remember thinking this. I would hear these talks on forgiveness that would always really frustrate me. And it would really come down to, well, just forgive them and then it's over. And I think what was so hard for me, I was like, but you don't just forgive once if they continue to hurt you. Or you don't just forgive once if I've been in pain or their absence creates more pain. Or what do you do with that? And I remember being a kid, and one of my heroes is actually, the book that I told you is by Andy. His dad is Dr. Charles Stanley. And Dr. Charles Stanley we would watch on TV when I was a kid before we'd go to church, which is always funny. That's how much church I had growing up. I would like watch it as I'm putting on my khakis and my butt, you know, and then we'd go to church. And I'll never forget as a kid listening to him talk about growing up without a father at some point. And one of the stories that Andy tells and that Charles tells is that he walked through that process. Here's who it is that owes me something. Here's what they owe me. He tells this story, and I love it. He tells a story about going to a restaurant and sitting down as if he were going to have a conversation with his dad. And he just goes through it. Here's what you did, and here's all these things. I just imagine this as like Applebee's. I don't know why, because that's where you go when you forgive somebody. And he's walking through all this stuff. At the end of it, he said these words, and I think it's so powerful. It's like, and the debt is now settled. You don't owe me any more. And the follow-up question is, well, what happens when it comes back? What happens when those emotions come back? What happens when it bubbles back inside of you? And I love his response, because the churchy response is, it doesn't, because you're done. That was the thing that always drove me nuts. You're done. You forgave him. And that's just a load of crap. Like, it's just not, because it comes back. And when it comes back with the same force. And then the question is, for you, is the debt settled or is it not settled? And Dr. Charles Stanley goes, you feel all of it, and you stare it in the face, and you let yourself experience all of those things. And then you come back to at the end, is this debt settled or not? And he would say it's not. And he would say it again. You don't owe me anymore. So I'm going to tell you these two phrases. I wish I could just teach everybody these two phrases. They don't owe me anymore. And this doesn't own me anymore. And you go, but am I going to not feel it anymore? No, you probably will. And there's some pain that outside of the miraculous work of Jesus you may feel. But it doesn't have to control you. And it doesn't have to own you. And it doesn't have to be the only part of your story. And it doesn't have to spill out in anger over everybody that you care about for the rest of your life. Because they don't owe you anymore. And this doesn't own you anymore. So the way we're going to wrap up our time together is this. It's a great way to kick off a series. Get everybody feeling it real deep first, right? I didn't expect that. Next week we're going to talk about happy. That'll be great. That's not true. It'll be even worse next week. I'm just kidding. Here's what we're going to do. Most of us carry some form of unforgiveness to some degree. And most of us, it comes out in passive-aggressive anger or highly aggressive anger. Some of you are driving and you're real mad at the truck driver next to you, but you're not, I love that 11 o'clock gets all the fun stuff. I love that I knew I was going to preach on this, and then yesterday I was frustrated already about some stuff. And I was taking out the trash, and I forgot I had the trash in the car. And I drove too fast, and it all went on the highway, so I had to pick it all up. And I thought I got it all, and I put it back up there, and my kids are in the car. And I go to take the trash off, and it's got almost a full cake in it for my son's birthday party that's like a week old, and also all the dirty diapers. Knowing I'm going to talk about anger, I went to take it off, and then the whole thing just fell all over me and our car, to which my kids saw not a pastor in that moment. And I was so angry. I was putting all that stuff up going, I'm not ever teaching on anger again. I was like, what was I actually upset about? Because as frustrating as that was, it wasn't that. It was something completely different. Most of us carry this to some degree. So what I want you to do today is, I'm not going to ask you to forgive somebody today. Some of you aren't ready to forgive somebody today. But I want you to take like the first couple of steps towards it. Now some of you are. Some of you are like, hey, it's time. You're going to do that now. And you're going to move. And that's great. But a lot of you are going to go, I'm just going to start the direction of where we're going. So we're going to ask you to do, and it feels like a little bit of a churchy thing, but I don't know how else to do it. I'd love for you for a moment, just close your eyes for a second, bow your heads if you would. And I want you more just to have space to reflect just for a second. And I'm going to ask you two things, right? And I want you to answer these as honestly as you possibly can. The first question is this. Like, who is it? Who is it that we're talking about for you? Or who are they? Or what is that thing? Is it a work thing? Somebody got promoted over you? Is it a family thing? Did they rob you of something in your family? Is it the parent who missed the things and is it that you grew up too fast and you shouldn't have had to? Are you sitting next to them? Is it a spouse thing? That's always hard too. Is it that? Is it a parent thing? Who is it? Second question is, what do they owe you? What is it? What do they actually owe you? You have all the things that they would have to do to pay you back, but what is it that they owe you? And then with your heads bowed, eyes closed, I'm going to ask you to do. If you're a follower of Jesus, I'd love for you to pray this prayer. If you're not a follower of Jesus, it can't hurt to pray this prayer. What I'm going to ask you to pray is, God, help me release the debt. God, help me release the debt. Help me release it. Now, if you would, with your heads bowed, eyes closed just for a second. What I'm going to ask you to do this week is to take 20 seconds or 30 seconds every day and do this. Who is it that owes you? What do they owe you? And then pray that simple prayer, God, help me release the debt. And some of you, you're going to do this right now. You're going to say, God, I release that debt. And you're going to do it. But what I'm going to pray for you is you're able to do that at some point this week. That the prayer of God, help me to release the debt, becomes, God, they don't owe me any more. It's settled. So, Father, for every person in this room, including me, for most of it's so clear on who it is we need to forgive. And it's pretty clear on what they owe us. And it's just so hard to do sometimes. But God, I ask that you would help us. You would help us to release the debt that was never going to fully be repaid anyway. For those people in this room that are waiting for somebody else to make it right, knowing that it's probably never going to happen. God, it's not even up to the other person to make it right. In a lot of these cases, it's just there. It just exists. So Father, help us to cancel that debt. Help us to unlock that door. Help us to get out of that cage. Help us to move forward with freedom. And at the same time, God, I pray that every person in this room who calls you Savior, God, I pray that then you would empower us to be that redemptive force in the world that is known by our grace and forgiveness of others. And when it comes back and when we feel those emotions and when it's so prevalent and when it's so present, help us to feel all of it. Help us to, even if we're afraid of it, help us to feel all of it and look at it in the face and then remind ourselves that it's settled. And God, we just ask that freedom would come from that and more redemptive work would come from that. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.